Hello, I'm Hope Logan. I am an actor on Bold and the Beautiful, and many people really love both me and our Bold and the Beautiful drama. So I've come here to share updates about my beloved Bold and the Beautiful. Everyone, please subscribe and support me. If you do, I will keep coming every day with new updates for you. The storm brewing inside the halls of Forrester Creations was no longer just about business. Beneath the polished glamour, designer gowns, and carefully rehearsed smiles, old wounds and bitter rivalries were beginning to crack wide open once again. At the center of it all stood Steffy Forrester Finnegan, fiercely protective of both her family legacy and the power she had fought so hard to keep. The tension surrounding the future of the company had reached a dangerous boiling point, and every conversation carried the sharp edge of betrayal waiting to happen. Ridge Forrester found himself trapped between loyalty, love, and responsibility, but the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. In the end, it appeared that Ridge was preparing to stand beside his daughter, choosing Steffy's vision for the company over Brooke Logan Forrester's growing ambitions. And with that single decision looming over the family like dark thunderclouds, everything Brooke and Hope had been fighting for suddenly seemed terrifyingly fragile. For Brooke, the possibility of losing the co-CEO position felt far more painful than a simple professional disappointment. Running Forrester Creations beside Ridge had represented something deeply personal, a symbol of unity, trust, and a future where their partnership could finally feel secure again. But now, that dream seemed to be slipping through her fingers before it ever had the chance to fully become reality. Ridge's likely decision to keep Brooke confined to the executive team rather than elevating her to co-CEO carried an emotional sting that went beyond titles and boardroom politics. It was another painful reminder that when the pressure mounted, Ridge often gravitated back towards Steffy and the Forrester side of the family. Brooke could feel the distance forming even before the official words were spoken, and the disappointment threatened to settle heavily across her heart. Around her, the luxurious offices of Forrester Creations suddenly felt colder, quieter, and far less welcoming than they once had. But if Brooke's heartbreak simmered beneath the surface, Hope Logan Spencer's frustration threatened to ignite into something far more explosive. Hope had already been struggling under the weight of uncertainty surrounding hope for the future, the fashion line that carried not only her professional reputation but also years of personal passion and determination. The project had stalled, suspended in limbo while Steffy refused to offer a relaunch date, and every delay felt more deliberate than the last. Hope could sense the message Steffy was sending without needing it spoken aloud, that her future inside the company was hanging by a thread. Watching her mother potentially lose the co-CEO opportunity only deepened Hope's anger and helplessness. To Hope, it began to feel as though every path forward was being deliberately blocked by Steffy's influence. And with each passing day, the resentment between the two women grew darker, sharper, and far more personal than anyone wanted to admit. Steffy, however, was no stranger to conflict, especially when it involved the Logans. From her perspective, Hope's support of Brooke's co-CEO push was not some innocent business strategy. Steffy believed it was retaliation, a calculated attempt to undermine her authority and strip away the control she had worked tirelessly to secure. That suspicion planted something dangerous inside her, a cold determination that began to overshadow even the business side of the situation. If Hope wanted to play power games through Brooke, Steffy might decide she was more than capable of fighting back on her own terms. Up until now, Steffy had carefully framed her decision to pause Hope for the future as a practical business move, insisting it was about profits, priorities, and the direction of the company. But beneath that professional explanation, emotions had been quietly simmering for a long time. And now, with tensions escalating across every corner of Forrester Creations, Steffy seemed closer than ever to dropping the mask entirely. Long before the co-CEO chaos erupted, Steffy had already been questioning whether Hope and her fashion line were worth the constant conflict they brought into the company. Every disagreement, every family argument, every emotional confrontation seemed tied to hope for the future in one way or another. To Steffi, the line had started to feel less like an asset and more like a burden that continuously dragged the company into emotional warfare. If Ridge officially secured Steffi's leadership status and reinforced her authority, that power could become the final piece she needed to make a devastating decision. Instead of merely delaying Hope's relaunch, Steffi could decide to shut the entire line down for good. The possibility lingered heavily in the air like an approaching storm, threatening to destroy years of Hope's hard work in a single ruthless move. And for Steffi, the act would not simply be about business efficiency, it would be a statement. Of course, a decision that massive would likely still require Ridge's approval, and that reality added another emotional layer to the unfolding battle. Ridge might hesitate at first, fully aware of how deeply Hope's line mattered to Brooke and Hope alike, but even he could find himself reluctantly acknowledging the uncomfortable truth behind Steffi's argument. Hope for the future was no longer the powerhouse it once had been. The numbers were no longer impossible to ignore, and the line's profitability had faded significantly over time. Inside a competitive fashion empire like Forrester Creations, sentiment alone could not justify endless resources and attention. The fact that the line continued taking a backseat to couture already spoke volumes about where the company's priorities truly stood. And as painful as it might be for Hope to hear, Ridge could ultimately convince himself that Steffi's decision made practical sense, even if the emotional consequences threatened to tear the family apart. Still, practicality would only tell part of the story. Deep down, Steffi's potential decision carried the unmistakable fingerprints of revenge. The wounds between Steffi and Hope had never fully healed, no matter how many temporary truces or forced moments of peace they attempted to maintain. Every betrayal, every rivalry over love, family, and power had layered itself into years of unresolved resentment. Now, as Hope appeared to push Brooke toward the co-CEO seat in what Steffi viewed as a direct challenge to her authority, Steffi's patience seemed to be evaporating completely. Canceling Hope for the future would allow her to reclaim control in the most brutal way possible, sending a message that no one could threaten her position without consequences. Yet Steffi could still defend herself publicly by pointing toward the declining numbers, the wasted resources, and the company's need to move forward. In her mind, the personal and professional motivations had become tangled together so tightly that separating them no longer even mattered. As the pressure mounted, the looming question became impossible to ignore. Had Hope's attempt to elevate Brooke into the co-CEO position triggered a chain reaction that would backfire in the worst possible way? What began as a strategic effort to strengthen Brooke's influence inside the company now threatened to cost Hope everything she had built. The emotional stakes surrounding Hope for the future had suddenly become terrifyingly real, and every glance exchanged between Hope and Steffi carried the tension of an approaching collision. Inside the glamorous world of Forrester Creations, where family and business had always existed on dangerously thin boundaries, another devastating power struggle was taking shape. And as alliances hardened and emotions spiraled further out of control, Hope stood on the edge of receiving news that could permanently alter her future at the company. The walls seemed to be closing in around her, and the once bright future she envisioned for herself and her line now flickered uncertainly beneath the shadow of Steffi's growing vengeance. The atmosphere inside Forrester Creations became heavier with every passing hour, as though the building itself could sense the emotional explosion waiting just beneath the surface. Employees moved cautiously through the elegant corridors, their whispers growing quieter whenever Hope Logan Spencer or Steffy Forrester Finnegan appeared nearby. The company that had once symbolized glamour, creativity, and family legacy was beginning to feel like a battlefield disguised in couture and polished marble floors. Hope tried desperately to maintain her composure, but behind every forced smile and professional conversation, fear was beginning to take root inside her. She could feel the shift happening around her, subtle but undeniable. Meetings grew colder, updates about hope for the future became increasingly vague, and every unanswered question from Steffi felt like another warning sign pointing toward disaster. Deep down, Hope was beginning to realize that the line she had poured her heart into might already be slipping away from her. For Hope, the possibility of losing hope for the future was not merely about fashion or business status. That line represented years of determination, countless sacrifices, and the dream she had fought to build into something meaningful inside the powerful Forrester empire. It had become part of her identity, proof that she could stand on her own and create something respected beyond the endless Logan Forrester family feuds. The thought of Steffi erasing all of that with a single executive decision felt almost unbearable. Worse still was the growing suspicion that this was no longer about profits or strategy at all. Hope could sense the personal anger behind Steffi's actions now more clearly than ever before. Every delay, every refusal to set a relaunch date, every cold interaction between them seemed charged with years of unresolved bitterness that neither woman had truly escaped. And as those emotions continued building beneath the surface, Hope's anxiety slowly transformed into anger of her own. Meanwhile, Brooke Logan Forrester found herself watching the painful unraveling of events with growing heartbreak. She had hoped the co-CEO opportunity would finally stabilize things, not only for herself and Ridge, but for Hope as well. Brooke believed that with more influence inside the company, she could protect Hope's future and prevent Steffi from weaponizing her authority. But now that Hope appeared to be collapsing before her eyes, Ridge's loyalty to Steffi was becoming impossible to ignore, and Brooke could feel the familiar ache of history repeating itself once again. No matter how much Ridge loved her, there always seemed to come a moment when his connection to his children and the Forrester legacy outweighed everything else. Brooke understood his conflict, but understanding it did not make the pain easier to bear. Watching Hope become increasingly vulnerable under Steffi's control awakened a fierce protectiveness inside Brooke, and she knew another confrontation was inevitable. Ridge, however, was carrying a burden of his own as tensions closed in around him from every direction. He loved Brooke, cared deeply about Hope, and understood exactly how devastating the loss of hope for the future would be. But at the same time, he could not completely dismiss Steffi's reasoning. The company was changing, the fashion industry was evolving, and difficult decisions had to be made to protect Forrester Creations from unnecessary instability. Ridge had spent his entire life balancing family emotion against business survival, and the weight of those choices had begun carving visible exhaustion into his face. Every conversation with Brooke left him emotionally drained, while every discussion with Steffi reminded him how fiercely determined his daughter had become. He could see the anger building between the two sides of the family like a fire spreading out of control, yet no solution seemed capable of satisfying everyone anymore. And somewhere deep inside, Ridge feared that whichever decision he ultimately supported would permanently fracture the fragile peace holding the family together. Steffi, meanwhile, appeared calmer on the surface than anyone else. But beneath that composed exterior, her emotions were burning fiercely. She had spent years fighting to protect both her family's company and her own place within it, often feeling as though the Logans constantly challenged or undermined her authority. To her, Brooke's co-CEO push had crossed a line that could not simply be ignored. It felt strategic, calculated, and deeply personal, especially with Hope standing firmly behind it. Steffi convinced herself that if Hope wanted to escalate the battle, then consequences were inevitable, The more she reflected on the situation, the more certain she became that hope for the future had outlived its value to the company. Even if revenge played a role in her thinking, Steffi believed she could still justify the decision professionally, and that belief made her dangerously confident as she prepared for what might become one of the most ruthless choices of her career. As rumors quietly spread through Forrester Creations about the possible cancellation of Hope for the future, the emotional pressure surrounding Hope intensified dramatically. She began feeling isolated inside a company where she once believed she belonged. Every conversation seemed loaded with pity or nervous curiosity, and the uncertainty started eating away at her confidence piece by piece. Even moments of silence became unbearable because silence left too much room for fear and imagination. Hope started replaying every decision that had led to this point, wondering if supporting Brooke's co-CEO ambitions had unintentionally pushed Steffi toward retaliation. What was supposed to strengthen their position inside the company might instead destroy the very thing Hope had fought hardest to protect. And with every passing day, that possibility felt less like a threat and more like an approaching certainty. The emotional divide between the Forresters and Logans soon began spilling far beyond the executive offices, infecting every corner of the family dynamic. Old wounds that had never fully healed resurfaced with renewed intensity, bringing years of resentment crashing back into the present. Conversations became sharper, colder, and increasingly impossible to repair once harsh words were spoken. Family dinners turned tense, simple interactions became emotionally charged, and everyone seemed forced to choose sides whether they wanted to or not. Through it all, Hope and Steffi remained locked in a silent emotional war, each convinced the other had pushed things too far. Neither woman was willing to back down, and that refusal threatened to drag the entire family into deeper chaos. What had started as a business disagreement was rapidly transforming into something far more destructive, a personal war fueled by pride, betrayal, and years of unresolved pain. And looming over everything was the devastating possibility that Hope was about to receive news that would change her future forever. The uncertainty surrounding Hope for the future had become unbearable, hanging over her life like a dark cloud ready to burst at any moment. If Steffi truly moved forward with canceling the line completely, Hope would lose far more than a professional opportunity. She would lose a dream, a purpose, and a part of herself that she had spent years building against impossible odds. The emotional fallout from such a decision would ripple through Brooke, Ridge, and the entire family, leaving scars that might never fully heal. Yet inside the ruthless world of power and legacy that defined Forrester Creations, emotions rarely stopped difficult decisions from being made. And as the battle lines hardened and tensions reached their breaking point, it became painfully clear that the next move could change everything forever. The tension finally reached a point where even the luxurious walls of Forrester Creations could no longer contain the emotional pressure building inside them. Every hallway conversation seemed to stop the moment Hope Logan Spencer entered the room, and every glance from the staff carried the uneasy awareness that something devastating was coming. The atmosphere had become painfully fragile, as though one wrong word could trigger an explosion capable of tearing the company apart from the inside out. Hope tried to focus on work, tried to convince herself that there was still time for things to change, but the uncertainty was slowly draining the strength from her spirit. Each day that passed without answers from Steffi felt deliberate, almost cruel, like a silent punishment designed to keep her emotionally cornered. The waiting became unbearable, and the fear of losing everything she had worked for settled heavily into her chest. Somewhere deep inside, Hope could already feel her world beginning to crack. At the same time, Steffy Forrester Finnegan stood firmly in the center of the storm she had helped create, refusing to show even the slightest sign of hesitation. To the outside world, she maintained the image of a strong executive making difficult business decisions for the future of the company. But privately, her emotions were far more complicated than she wanted anyone to know. Years of rivalry with Hope had hardened her heart in ways that even she no longer fully recognized. Every betrayal, every painful memory, every moment she had felt threatened by the Logans seemed to echo louder now that power rested so completely in her hands. In Steffi's mind, Hope and Brooke had attempted to undermine her authority through the co-CEO push, and she refused to allow that challenge to go unanswered. The deeper the conflict became, the more determined Steffi grew to prove that she alone controlled the future of Forrester Creations. Ridge Forrester could feel the emotional damage spreading through the family with terrifying speed, and the weight of responsibility was beginning to crush him. He watched Brooke's disappointment grow more painful by the day, and he saw the growing fear behind Hope's increasingly guarded expressions. Yet every conversation with Steffi reminded him why she believed she was justified. The business realities were difficult to ignore, no matter how emotional the situation had become. Hope for the future simply was not performing the way it once had, and the company's resources were constantly being redirected elsewhere. Ridge understood the brutal truth of the fashion industry better than anyone. Sentiment could not save a failing line forever. Still, knowing that did not make the decision easier, because this was no longer just about business spreadsheets or profit margins. It was about family, loyalty, and the devastating realization that one decision could permanently destroy relationships that had already survived countless storms. Brooke Logan Forrester, meanwhile, felt a growing desperation she could no longer hide. Watching Hope's future hang in the balance awakened the fierce protective instincts that had always defined her as a mother. Brooke knew how much hope for the future meant to her daughter because she had witnessed every sacrifice, every sleepless night, and every emotional struggle that went into building it. The idea that Steffi might erase all of that out of revenge filled Brooke with both anger and heartbreak. What hurt even more was the growing sense that Ridge was slipping further away from her emotionally as he continued siding with Steffi. Brooke had fought for years to preserve her relationship with Ridge through endless betrayals, separations, and family wars, but this situation felt dangerously different. This time it was not simply about romance or jealousy, it was about power, legacy, and the future of their children inside the family empire. And Brooke feared that if Ridge allowed Steffi to destroy Hope's line, the damage between them might become impossible to repair. As emotions intensified, Hope found herself becoming more isolated than ever before. The company that once felt like home now seemed filled with invisible walls closing in around her. Every boardroom discussion, every tense silence, and every delayed answer from Steffi chipped away at the confidence she had fought so hard to maintain. But beneath the fear and sadness, something else slowly began to emerge: determination. Hope had spent years being underestimated, dismissed, and pushed aside whenever the Forresters decided she no longer fit into their vision. She was tired of feeling powerless while other people dictated her future. If Steffi truly intended to destroy Hope for the future, then Hope knew she could not simply stand by and accept it quietly. The emotional pain was beginning to transform into resolve, and for the first time in weeks, there was a dangerous spark growing behind her heartbreak. Steffi, however, remained convinced that she was making the right choice, even as the emotional consequences grew larger around her. She looked at the situation through the lens of survival for the company, for her leadership, and for the Forrester legacy itself. In her mind, allowing Hope and Brooke to gain more influence inside the company threatened everything she had fought to protect. The co-CEO battle had forced Steffi into a corner emotionally, and now she was prepared to push back with full force. Canceling Hope for the future would not only remove what she saw as an underperforming line, but also send an unmistakable message about who truly held power at Forrester Creations. The decision carried both professional logic and deeply personal revenge intertwined together so completely that Steffi no longer tried separating them. To her, this was about taking control before someone else took it from her first. And then came the terrifying realization that the moment of truth was drawing dangerously close. Rumors spread faster throughout the company, whispers growing louder with every passing hour. Employees began speculating openly about Hope's future, while tensions between the Logans and Forresters became impossible to hide. The emotional divide inside the family had reached a level where even ordinary interactions felt painfully strained. Hope could sense that everyone around her was bracing for impact, waiting for the final decision that would either save or destroy everything she had built. The uncertainty became suffocating, wrapping around her life like a shadow she could no longer escape. And as the storm inside Forrester Creations moved closer to its breaking point, one painful truth became impossible to ignore. No matter what happened next, nothing inside this family would ever be the same again.